Outside that, it's here. Outside this.
Who's there? All right, we are about to start. We have 1 minute to go, and we'll be starting just now. We're going to be starting soon. We've got 1 minute to go, and we're going to be starting soon. Give me that. All right. Okay, Facebookers, we are here. And let's go live on Twitter. So welcome. Welcome to our live session. It's session 9 today. And we are talking about quantitative research. We're talking about doing quantitative research. Of course, I've never done quantitative research in my studies, but I know that it's valuable, and I know that it is used by many researchers, and it informs a lot of work that's done by policymakers, and so it is an important design to use. And today, I have invited two colleagues, Dr. Latif and Professor John Ataguba, and they're going to talk to us about doing quantitative research. Today, there's a tricky thing going on. The network is not good, and so I'm connecting on different devices. I'm doing for the first time with Facebookers on the laptop. And Twitter, welcome. You are on a device, and this is the device, the Twitter one, the one that's been giving us trouble. If we get cut, I'm advising you to join us on another platform. We are on Instagram. The Instagram platform and Wi-Fi there has been a little more stable. So if you get cut on Twitter, look for @Fab Academic on Instagram, and you'll get us there. And Facebookers, I hope we remain stable. It's been stable on this device, and I hope it remains that way for the rest of the time. But I'm looking forward to this session. I've never done quantitative research, but I think it's very important, and it's very important that we develop capacity in that area. The questions that we'll be asking today is why? Why is it important sometimes to quantify the problem? Okay, we explore different problems in research. And there comes a time when we want to quantify the problem. And of course, that's when we need quantitative research. But quantifying the problem doesn't give us all the answers that we need about the phenomenon that we're studying. It gives us just one gaze. So there's a gaze, a quantitative gaze to the problem, but we can have other looks at the problem. And that's why we also do qualitative research. So it's many universities, when they teach research methodology, they would have a section on doing quantitative research. And so we thought this is important to do. Note that it's not every study that has to have quantitative research. Some people also reject quantitative research just as not useful at all, that it is politically not the right thing to do or whatever. I want to say to you, there's value in quantitative research. There are questions that we can understand, explore much better if we do quantitative. I'll also, of course, ask Dr. Latif and Professor John Ataguba to talk to us about mixed methods. Some people use both quantitative and qualitative, and they can talk to us about why is that sometimes necessary. And then I also want them to share with us the work that they have done, the studies that they have done where they have used quantitative work. Of course, we only have an hour, So we won't go into the whole entire presentation of their studies, but we just want to get a sense of what kinds of question. And also because the two of them are academics, and they work with students. They've worked with many students over and over again, so they have a sense of what kinds of problems or challenges that students have about quantitative research or doing quantitative research, and they can share those problems with us. They can share with us what are those challenges that some students face, and then they can tell us how they have helped students address those challenges. We also have questions that you have sent through Twitter, and thanks to the Past 3M squad who I work with, who collate the questions, clean them up, and then send them so that the people that I'm engaging with, can respond to the questions. I've got those questions. We'll spend a bit of time responding to those questions with Dr. Latif and Professor Taguba. As I'm talking, I'm going to ask that Dr. Latif gets ready, because I want to go to Dr. Latif just now. Dr. Latif, of course, is a staff member here at UCT, and we'll ask him first. He's in the Graduate School of Business, and I'll ask him first to talk to us about what he does, sort of his background, and then we can know who we are working with. Tweeters, I'm trying to get us to get Dr. Latif today. Dr. Latif, thank you so much for joining me again today. I really appreciate you making the time. Okay. And we're talking about quantitative research today. And but first, you haven't told the students who are joining us online about, you haven't told them about what your area of study is. And I thought perhaps we should start there. What's your area of study, and so that they can understand the person that you are.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Basically, my research focus on analyzing the firm behavior from an industrial perspective. So it's normally classified as the industrial organization of financial services industry, mostly banks and insurance companies. So my PhD was on the short-term insurance industry, analyzing issues relating to the efficiency, the competitive conduct, how they price their product, and how it affects performance as well, and the stability of the industry. So in executing such research, my research approach has been mostly quantitative. So probably all my research, I would say 100% have mostly applied the quantitative approach here to research. So that is a little perspective about my research focus. But I belong to the School of Development Finance, where we try to understand how you make finance work for development, not just focusing on the returns from investment decisions. What are the sustainability aspects of it? What is the implications on the society, on the environment of using certain financial instruments and financial assets? So that is my broad academic background.
Okay. Thank you very much, Latif, for sharing that. So you are the best person we can get today, because most of your research has been quantitative. Yes, what makes quantitative research design critical? What are the kinds of questions that you would say you cannot explore this question without doing quantitative? Can I just check maybe the colleagues who are on Facebook? Let me know if the sound is not clear, so that we can attend to that. If I'm not seeing comments like that from you, I assume that it's all good. I'll keep looking. You tell me if the sound is okay. Yerima Mukobe, let me know if the sound is okay. So, what kind of studies would say definitely it has to be quantitative?
Okay. Thanks very much. I think before I even answer that question, I think from experience with supervising students, I think there is an error where students normally they come in with some conceived ideas about, based on their strength. I'm not a numbers person, so I don't want to do quantitative. I don't want to do qualitative. But you look at their research question, I'm like, no. So the basic indicator of examining whether. So mostly what research method is referred to as the use of appropriate methodology. Is your research method appropriate to answer your research questions? So to identify whether you're using the appropriate approach, the best cue is to look at your research question, to unpack your research question.
Yeah.
To give you a
so
good
it's about
sense.
your research question.
Yes.
So you can't ask a research question that needs a quantitative approach and then say you are not a numbers person.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Give us an example of the kind of question that you would say you cannot answer this, even if it's not in finance, probably in an area that people can. That would say you would not be able to answer this question if you don't use quantitative approach.
Okay. Let's say probably a classical example would be to examine maybe the impact of COVID on SME performance or SME survival. Yes. So when you're looking about performance is mostly a quantitative metric. You cannot measure a performance by asking a qualitative question, or such questions cannot be answered qualitatively. My performance has been good. My performance has been bad. How? It will be good because maybe your revenues have been increasing. So that gives you the indicator. It means revenue is a quantitative figure. If it has been increasing, what was it previously? What is it now?
Yes.
So we set questions. Yes, you are more likely to delve into the quantitative kind of approach.
And how do you start designing a quantitative study? Where do you start if you were to design a study?
Okay. So I think you did mention earlier about the various categories. So so you need to, the first stage is when it's appropriate, and I think that is what this discussion, the earlier response has highlighted. When is it appropriate? When you examine, you want to understand the effect of certain indicators on another indicator, to examine the relationship between constructs. Then you are more likely to use a quantitative approach. In some instances, you may want to move beyond that, just examining the effect of, let's say, COVID on SME performance. You may want to examine SMEs' experiences in dealing with the challenges posed by this.
Now that's qualitative. If you want their experiences, then you are going to the qualitative.
Yes.
Because then you have to get the experience from the people.
Yes, and these experiences cannot be derived from their profit statement or other quantitative indicators. In that sense, if you have two, you could have two questions, one related to the experiences, the other related to the performance. That will bring you to the realm of the combination of the qualitative and the quantitative, which will be the mixed method approach. So a single answer to, if you want to undertake any mixed method research, you should have two separate questions. Question one, or part of the questions related to quantitative approach, and questions which has to be addressed using the qualitative approach. So that would be just that, a brief on the rationale for the use of the mixed method approach. Now, coming back to the design of a quantitative study, I will classify them under two broad categories, determined on the type of data you are using for quantitative research. You could use a secondary data collection, or you could use a primary data collection, which is normally a survey form. And each of these approach would influence how it is designed. The first stage of any design stage, whether qualitative, mixed method approach, is your sample. How do you arrive at your sample? How do you select your sample? So before that, you first need to identify the population. If you are talking about SMEs, yes, if it's the study is in South Africa, then perhaps SMEs in South Africa or the Western Cape could be your population. But how do you go about identifying the proportion of the SMEs to use for your study, which will fall into what is called a sampling approach? You need to, and the reason, I think one of the questions was about the using of why do you even sample? You could sample because of a lot of dynamics, because of time limitation, and also the cost involved in reaching the population, especially if it relates to the use of primary data collection.
Yeah.
So you could be limited, and for master's students, you may have a limited time period within which you have to do the study. So you may not have endless amount of time to cover all the population. So these are some of the dynamics which may influence the sample selection.
Yeah.
Yes, and for quantitative studies, the most common form of sampling is the probability sampling, because the element of, or the essence of quantitative study is the ability to generalize. So you want to use a sampling technique which would give equal chances of all the members of the population being selected for the study. So you wouldn't be biased in selecting certain sample, which would ultimately affect the kind of conclusions that you draw. So once you identify your population and you use the various probability sampling technique to identify your sample, the next stage is you do the data collection. So let me go back. So for secondary data, what I described was the primary data. For secondary data, you don't have to, most of it would be outsourced or have been collected by an external entity. So the data is external to your study.
Yeah.
So for said data, in most instances, the idea is that because you don't have those challenges of arriving at getting all the population, the challenges with time, the norm is that you should try to use probably the whole population.
Yes.
But sometimes we have instances of what is termed as missing data. So depending on the type of quantitative data, whether it's a cross-sectional, a time series, or panel, you may have certain period where you don't have data for the cross-sectional unit, and that could help you define the parameters, how length in time you have to go, and the number of cross-sectional you have to use. So you move, once you identify your sample, the next stage is you collect your data. For primary data collection, you have to design a survey tool to collect the data. So you have to describe what that survey tool is about. And the importance of that questionnaire is that it should help you answer your research question. So the design of the research tool should take into account the kind of questions that you are seeking to answer. And if you are measuring constructs, let's say you want to examine, let's say, the happiness of the happiness of a certain group of individuals, you may use a happiness construct, which you would have identified from the literature. So this goes back to one of the questions.
So someone is asking here, Sam is asking, can a quantitative approach still be used in case of case study method? Okay, so I could be doing a case study and then I still, within that case, use quantitative. Tell us how.
Yes, because I think the traditional definition of case study relates to mostly the qualitative school of design. But in quantitative, it can also be applied. If you are studying South Africa, South Africa becomes a case. Africa can become a case. Selection of SADC country can become a case. Selection of businesses or firms can become a case. So in that context, yes, you can describe it as, but it doesn't fit that traditional qualitative description of a case study.
Yeah. Again, it's informed by your question.
Yes, it's informed by your question.
So it's not that any case you have 6 people and do it. It's really informed by what's the question that you're asking. Because as you say, you say South Africa can be a case, but South Africa itself is big.
Yes, it's big. Yes.
So,
yes, it's big. Yes. So in that sense, in that sense, you need to motivate. There should be, in your problematization, you would have provided a justification as to why we should care, as to why this is a problem in South Africa, and how studying this in South Africa or a province or a cross-section of provinces in South Africa will help and enhance our understanding of that case.
Good. You were proceeding to explain. You had started talking about how you design such a study, and then I popped in this question. Do you want to continue?
Yes. So with your once, yes, I think I wanted to answer a question related to. Let me review. Yes, it was about.
You should say, wait, who gave the question so that they can hear we are answering their question.
Okay, so it was Eric Melime. He was how do I evaluate Yes, how do I evaluate the significance of reviewing literature, reviewing the research process? So so I think it goes back to the example I wanted to use in when you want to understand or measure happiness.
Yeah.
How do you identify the construct happiness? How has it been used in the literature? So your method would be a build-up of, that's why literature review is very important. You are taking a cue of what others have done. How has happiness been measured in the body of knowledge, and how do you adapt it to your circumstances? So literature is very important in identification of the construct that you seek to measure, and even the techniques that you seek to use to analyze the data that you have collected. So so in that sense, yes, so the literature review plays an important part in the design of your survey tool to collect the data. If you want to measure happiness, you may want to adopt some constructs in the literature, and that should be part of your survey tool. And once you now you have your sample, you have your data collection tool for primary data. Yes, for secondary data, you have your data source. Where do you get that data from? So for secondary data, you don't normally have the description of data collection. It would be a description of data source. Where did you get that data from? So you've assessed the data for primary data. You've collected your PS data to the survey tool. The next stage would be, how do you analyze it? And from supervising students, I think normally you have instances where they do the data collection, and that's the end of the method. I'm like, so what are you going to do with the data? So that's one of the most important things. Once you collect the data,
then what?
Then what? How do you process the data to come up with certain conclusions? So you have to use that quantitative techniques. And for the most common form of a quantitative analytical framework is the regression framework, or regression analysis. So with regression analysis, depending on the type of study, you could have a cross-sectional kind of study where you examine different cross-sectional units, different students over a point in time. So if you want to examine the level of happiness of UCT students in 2020, so you maybe 10, 20,000 UCT students, in the specific year. Or perhaps you may want to do a time series kind of study. You want to examine UCT students from maybe 1990s to date. So you may have to have a repeated observation, or maybe that could not be appropriate. Let's say you may want to examine the economic growth of South Africa over since 94. So you're looking at an aggregate data. So it may be the GDP growth indicator, or other kind of macroeconomic indicators. You examine them over that period of time. Or the type of quantitative study is what is referred to as the panel data study, where you look at the cross-sectional units over different time points. So I think most of my studies uses panel data, where I analyze different insurance companies. Let's say I have 100 insurance companies over different time periods. Let's say 10. So 100 insurance companies over 10 time periods. So it could be monthly, yearly, or quarterly data. That is what is called a panel type of data. So if you are using a quantitative kind of design, your approach, you may use one of these approaches. It could be, your data could be cross-sectional, time series, or panel. And if you are looking at survey studies, most survey studies relates to cross-sectional type of quantitative design, because it may be difficult because it's primary data that you have to collect. So if you want to use a time series, you have to wait for the period, for different time period, to be able to collect those data. So most survey studies are cross-sectional in nature. That is for primary, if the researcher is the one collecting the data, by himself or herself.
But we see a lot of quantitative research. They collect data online, or you send to like often. I mean, tell us, when it's time for elections, we get all these predictions about how is that done, and people will come out, and I mean, it's ordinary people in the street. They're saying, well, they're telling us this is how people told, but I never got it. So how do they know what I said? Is it reasonable for people to expect that? People expect that each one of us will get a a questionnaire, but it doesn't really work that way.
Yes, yes. So I think that relates to the development, yes, in the form of data collection, and perhaps this has been reinforced by this current climate where you don't. I think traditionally you had to visit the respondents in their place of work or house to do the data collection, but now based on the challenges and also cost purposes, it's much easier if people have access to internet where they design a survey monkey, yes, via email, and you do those kind of collection. In terms of the in terms of the question about who was covered and who wasn't covered, I think there are, again, it goes back to the literature. There are thresholds or the acceptable norms. You could send out an email to, let's say, 1,000 respondents, and it is accepted that not all of them would be able to yes. So within the literature, I think there's an acceptable threshold for primary data collection. I think it may be even less than 30% of what you send. So don't normally send, when you identify your sample, you should go beyond your sampling, yes, for the data collection.
Actually send to more people. But if we are struggling with Wi-Fi today,
I just saw that.
Yeah, it's load shedding, it's all sorts of things going on. I think
it's better now.
Yeah,
yes, I think it's better now. So I'll say, even if you identify your sample, let's say you want 100, to get closer to the 100, I would recommend you go beyond the 100, because not all of them are going to respond. So if you truly want to hit that 100 targets, you should go beyond maybe 50 additional, so that, yes, to increase the chances of hitting or meeting that criteria that you've set as your sample for the study.
Good. I can see that the people on Facebook have been cut. I don't know what's going on, but it stopped. But I did tell them, I hope they come and join us on this platform. I'll attend to it as we go along.
Yes.
I wonder if you have you have answers for any of the questions.
Yes, I'm looking at. I want to understand when it's going to use. Yes, I think someone, Tabo MK, asks, I want to understand when to use exploratory or confirmatory factor analysis. Okay, I think, yes, per their description, you could realize how they are used for certain constructs. Let's say happiness. Let's take happiness as a variable. Happiness could be made up of, let's say, two constructs: social happiness and economic happiness. And each of them have their set of questions that would have to be asked. For confirmatory, these have been used in the literature. And if you are adopting it for your study, for example, for students at UCT, you may want to just adopt that kind of the same construct that has been used in the literature. So you're trying to, in applying that to, you're trying to confirm, do these factors load appropriately on either social happiness or economic happiness. So you don't do much with, so you are using, as it has been used in the literature, to just confirm whether it applies to your sample. But for exploratory, you don't do the classification between economic and social happiness. You just ask all the questions, yes, without categorizing them under these two broad sections of happiness. So you ask all the questions on the happiness, and in analyzing or employing exploratory, the data is going to identify the underlying dimensions, which of them fall under economic and which of them fall under social happiness. So you don't box the respondent in categorizing that these sort of questions relate to economic happiness, these sort of questions relate to social happiness. You are just being open. You let the underlying dimensions of the data to be able to provide you with that kind of response.
Okay, all right. Dr. Latif, I can see that we are almost at 1:30.
Yes.
But I would like you to share more of the challenges that students face with quantitative. Before I call Professor Ataguba, who will share his perspective.
Okay. Well, okay. I think the most challenges I've observed, I think, relates to the measurement aspects. Yes.
Yeah.
because if you are doing quantitative, what you're seeking to do is you're seeking to measure something. In
Yes.
measuring, you may want to describe the level of happiness, whether the happiness is low or high, or you may want to expand and try to explain the differences in the level of happiness. You may want to use individual demography, maybe their income levels, their occupation. So from that kind of perspective, in the design of their data collection tool, you realize that, and that could be an element of maybe not having familiarized themselves with the literature. You have to be clear on the construct that you seek to measure. And if you familiarize yourself with the literature, that should be the basic, yes, that you should proceed from. The literature will give you basis as to how happiness has been measured. If you are going to the classical quantitative secondary data kind of study, if you want to assess the effect of size on performance, how is size measured? Again, the literature will give you a good guide. For the size of firms, I think the commonest approaches they use is sometimes the total asset of an organization, the number of employees of an organization, and sometimes the revenue base of an organization. So the limiting aspect I find in the student application of quantitative technique is the identification of how the variables are measured.
Yes.
Okay. That's the most common form. The students are not clear on how they are going to measure those variables in their study. And in addition, there's also lack of clarity in terms of, as I said, how to analyze the data. How do you analyze the data? If it's a regression model that you've specified, after measuring the variables, identifying the proxies, how do you estimate it? Do you use an ordinary least squares estimation technique, a panel data estimation technique, or any traditional time series estimation approaches? So these are the major, I think, limitations I find when students also have to design a quantitative study. And I think the last bit is there is something called hypothesis, which is most common for quantitative study. If you are examining, let's say, the effect of income on happiness, so you are saying income affects happiness. What is the basis? How are you theorizing that? How do you explain the transmission mechanism from having high levels of income to high levels of happiness? Perhaps, yes, if you have high income, you're able to satisfy most of your needs. So in that sense, there's also the limitation where students don't articulate how they expect what is normally termed as the independent variables or the explanatory factors of the dependent variable, which in this case is happiness. What explains happiness? You may identify income to be an explanatory factor of happiness. How do you do the theorization? How is that explained? And again, that will also come from is the literature. The literature, yes, if you have done a theoretical review on the relationship between happiness and income, that would give you a good idea of how to explain or how that linkage. Without that theoretical justification, there is no basis for the specification of your regression model. Every variable or every independent variable in the regression equation is suspected to have a certain kind of influence on the dependent variable, and that should be made clear. You need to explain how they provide a theoretical explanation of how that linkage, occurs.
I want to close this on a question that comes from it's underscore Kahu, and they say, I was about to ask a question along these lines. What happens when data collection is based on participation and you have lesser participation from one side of the researched party? So your sample, you have research, and then you've got too few people. What do you do?
Wow. That's a difficult. So I think I may have answered it. So don't go beyond that sample.
Okay.
Because if you're limiting it to that sample, that's where you say I'm 10-10. That your sample is 20. Then if you limit it, you administer only 20 questionnaires, then you have this incidence of the non-response having an effect.
But how do you go? How much more do you do? Is it advisable to do double the number that you need, or?
Yeah, it would depend. For quantitative studies, I think there's a convention that you need a minimum of, let's say, 30 observations. Yeah. So in that sense, so if you're using something around, let's say, if you're using the minimum, let's say 30, so then it means you may want to go beyond the 30. But if you have, let's say, 100, which is twice the double of that norm, so in that sense, you may be safer to go, let's say, maybe 10 or 20 above the 100, because even that 100 even is more than that conventional 30 minimum number of observation, which is acceptable. Yes,
so if you have the 30, you can still make generalization on the basis of 30.
Not really. Yes, not really. Yeah, so you have to be cautious. It depends on the population, and I think there are even matrices where, if you identify in the literature, there are some quantitative approaches. If you know the population, the total number of population, it gives you the appropriate sample, which will help you with the generalization. So there are metrics there. So if it's 100, if the population is 100, the appropriate sample to enhance the generalizability of the findings would be different from if your population is 1,000. So there's those matrices in the literature. So far as you're able to identify your population, you'll be able to estimate the appropriate sample, which will enhance the generalizability of the findings to that population.
Okay. All right, Latif, thank you so much for hooking up with us. Next week, I'm talking to people who have examined proposals. I'm sure you have examined many proposals, right?
Yes.
And I would like you to come back on board. I'll be talking with many of you so that we can give students about what kind of a proposal passes. More than anything, it's what makes a proposal fail. Like the kinds of weaknesses that you've seen marking proposals and that make proposals not succeed, so that students have an idea and before they submit their proposals. And I'm not talking the proposal that when the student applies, I'm talking about the proposal.
Okay, sure, Prof.
Right.
Okay, sure.
Thanks very much. I'll talk to you next week.
Okay, sure, Prof. And thanks everyone for joining me. Okay, bye.
We're going to be talking to Professor John Ataguba. It's a pity the people on Facebook, we lost them because they were having trouble. There was a trouble. I think I must just end this video and start a new live session on Facebook so that people can join us if they want. Let's see if it's possible to start a new live session on Facebook. We're going to do that before we call Professor John Ataguba online. Let's see. We go live. And there we are. Facebookers, welcome. We lost you. It's the connection today is not as favorable as it should be. And I can see John there. So welcome back. Professor John Ataguba is joining us just now. John, thank you very much for making the time to join us. So, John, can you perhaps just briefly tell the students out there your discipline and so on, so that people can. I remember that the last time I called you, students were raving about the fact that you did your PhD in 2 years or 1 year or 6 months. I don't know. So just tell them your discipline so that people have a sense of which background you come from.
Thank you very much, Prof. And thanks everyone for joining us. I am an economist who, over the years, found love in health issues. So they call us health economists. And the reason why I found love in health issues is mainly because I think to be able to deal with developing a country, you need to first of all get people who are healthy, because health is wealth, like people say. So that's who I am, and that's my discipline and my background. Yes, I did a PhD in economics.
Yes. And so, John, I'm sure you were listening to Latif talking to us about doing quantitative research. Do you have anything to add? I mean, and maybe as you add on that, I mean, last week when we spoke to Professor Zondi, he talked a lot about the importance of the researcher in the research. And I kept thinking, of course, in qualitative research, you are very much part of you are the first instrument. Now, perhaps you can, as you talk about things that Latif hasn't mentioned, consider what's the role of the researcher in that space? What's the impact of the researcher? Is it the same as it would be in qualitative research in this case?
A very, very good question. I'll first of all like to start by saying let's avoid some kind of generalization, because qualitative research there's no one thing called qualitative research, and each type of qualitative research will dictate the extent to which the principal investigator is very much active in the environment of the research. So let me quickly move into the quantitative research arena. In terms of quantitative research, it's pretty much similar. Depends on the kind of research you're doing. Some research could be experimental. Some could be quasi-experimental, and some could be cross-sectional. My colleague talked about that. And some could be longitudinal, what economists like calling time series. Panel. Or some can be time series. So basically, if you're dealing with time series data, most of these data have been collected by, for instance, StatSA. So all you need to do is get the data you're not seeing in the picture and analyze your data. Sometimes these data have to be collected as primary data collection, which my colleague talked about. That is, you as a researcher may have to be present where the data are being collected. Or you could hire data collectors or surveyors who go out to the field to collect data for you. So it depends on whether you are going to be collecting. If you, let me for instance, take that you are going to collect the data yourself, then if it's a traditional way, before COVID, you knock at someone's door, the person opens and you sit down, and for instance, you might be administering a questionnaire. Then in that case, you ask the question and the respondent provides the response. So there's some kind of interface between you, the researcher, and the respondent. So it depends on what quantitative data you're collecting. Some already collected by an external body, some you have to collect face-to-face, or you send your surveyors, if you have a lot of money to hire people, or sometimes you may collect your data by sifting through online responses, not necessarily an interface between you and the respondent directly, but through an online system.
Someone is asking, so I'm a student, do I need to be proficient in all these kinds of research approaches?
I would say no, but I would rather you know everything, because it is only by knowing everything that you know what is appropriate for you. If you don't, just know a bit of everything so that you can know what's appropriate for you, because how did you settle for what you're using if you never knew the alternative? And usually what I tell students is when you decide on what to do, it's important to justify why you're using that as opposed to other competing ways of doing something similar. Perhaps that question can be answered parsimoniously. It's important to keep this in mind. Can be answered parsimoniously using other methods. So why do you want to be you want to show how strong you are quantitatively when you could do it by something very simple?
Yeah. So it's important to know what's out there so that because if you don't know it's out there, then you don't know that you can use it. Definitely. So students, don't undermine other research design simply because you're not going to use it, because you don't know when you're going to use it. Just know that it's there, educate yourself, and then make a choice based on your question. John, I don't know if you looked at the questions and whether there are any questions that you want to answer. I'm keen also for you to talk to us about whether there are times when the qualitative research design is not appropriate, and we shouldn't even quantifying the problem doesn't actually help us understand the problem. And do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, sure, I can do that, Prof. I read through a comment that one really struck me by one commentator. Sorry, I couldn't remember your name because it was really flipping through as fast as
Yeah.
it could, but I read it. And the question was that quantitative research is bad, and if the person becomes the president, he or she is going to do something to quantitative researchers. I was like, okay, so maybe I'm ready to be dealt with.
Another generalization.
Yeah, correct. So I wouldn't really be hasty to make such kind of conclusions. One of the reasons I have alluded to earlier, in the sense that you don't have, it's not a single story. Okay, quantitative research is not a single story, and that brings me quickly to the question asked. Can you use quantitative methods to answer every question? It's like saying basically that can you use only one stone to kill all the birds on earth? I mean, it's the answer is very simple, but let me try to demystify it if it's something that we can call a mystery. There are things that are amenable to quantitative research, and there are some things that are totally amenable to qualitative research and can never be understood using quantitative methods. So it's important to, first of all, understand what you want to answer. What is the question? If the question is how many people, or rather, what's the proportion of children in South Africa who've contracted COVID-19, you can do that only by doing quantitative research, because your interest here is the proportion. So back to the person who asked that question, is it really bad for a researcher to really know what proportion of the population is suffering from a particular disease? Why would you want to shoot, according to the person's comment, why would you want to shoot the guy, a person who goes out to figure out the proportion of people who have fallen sick of a particular disease?
Yeah. And there's a Elconi who's asking the question: do I need to have a strong statistical background to do research that requires to do quantitative research, or can I do without it?
I would say yes and no. Okay, and you probably were wondering, why am I saying yes and no? Yes, in the sense that we encourage students as much as possible to do their own research, to be immersed in it. If you're doing a master's program, okay, my understanding of a master's program is you want to master a technique. Keep in mind, you want to be a master of something. You really want to go out and not master as a man, okay? It's unfortunate that term is used, master, okay, well, I hope you understand that context. So you really need to be someone who kind of is proficient in one thing. So if you really want to call yourself a master of something, then you should really invest in doing that thing yourself.
Yeah.
But if you move to a PhD level, then it becomes a place where you're doing a lot of things, but you're really going in depth. You may employ the services of a statistician to deal with certain aspects of your research. But that doesn't mean that you will not be immersed or become part of it. Usually, you might do a research in a team. And in that team, you have researchers who are skilled in statistics. Again, there is no one thing called statistics. There are many aspects of statistics. So you could have people who are skilled in various aspects of statistics. You could also have people who are economists like us, or people who are anthropologists, and people who are even media specialists, because you want to bring in all skills together into a pot, because one, you want that research to be rich and also be taken up for policy. So please, I will encourage you, if you're doing quantitative research, it's important to learn the skills and do it yourself, because if you do it yourself, you can teach others, rather than say, well, I see this result, what does it mean? I don't know where it's coming from. But if you know how to do it, if you see the results, you know where it's coming from.
That's very important, John. I've had so many students who've done quantitative studies, but they don't know how the analysis came from. They hired somebody to do the analysis for them. All they did is collect the data and then write up. So I don't know how that happens, but I wouldn't want to supervise a student like that. But I've also had situations where a student, after collecting data, goes to a statistician for help, and the person says, bogus data. There's nothing we can do here. This was bad. You should have come before you collected the data so that we can design together. And it seems to me that that's a very important point, because if you're going to do quantitative research, if your supervisor is not skilled in that, you've got to make sure that you get that help before, not after you've collected the data and then you don't know what to do with it. But actually your instrument should have been worked on differently. Can you talk a bit about that?
Very interesting. That's a very classic circumstance. I would really advise students to, first of all, seek help when they want to do quantitative research, most especially if it involves primary data collection. If it is not primary data collection, data are out there. All you need to do is go to Statistics SA and, for instance, use the General Household Survey, or use the Income and Expenditure Survey, or use the Victim of Crime Survey. There are many of such surveys out there that you could use. But if you're doing primary data collection, your sample, or what we call the sampling process, is very critical. Because the sampling process is what determines, to the greatest extent you could ever imagine, the way you can generalize the result. A question came up earlier in terms of, I wanted to collect maybe data on 300 people. I ended up with 200. What does that mean? Technically, what that means is that your power, what you call power, has reduced. Because keep in mind, when you computed your optimal sample size, you had at the back of your mind a certain power. It could be 80%. But when you end up with 200, your power has dropped from 80 to maybe 60% or 30, which means that is the extent to which you can really say something about the population from which your data come from. So it's advisable at that stage to either meet statisticians. We have a way of doing it, okay? Sometimes they can recalibrate your weights to be able to deal with non-response, to be able to deal with unobserved, some things that could be unobserved. There are ways to kind of adjust your weight. There's something we call sample weight to be able to help. But if that is not possible, for some reasons, it's possible, it's not possible, then you may have to go to the field to augment your data in a way. But that I would advise you speak to a statistician or an econometrician, or someone who's knowledgeable in that regard. So it's important to keep in mind that your sample is like saying that food, whenever you cook food, it will be as good as the ingredients that you use. And that is what sample is to an analyst, a researcher. Your sample, if it is not good, the result you get out of it will be as good as the sample you're using. So keep that at the back of your mind.
But it's also as good as the instrument you use, because you can have a good sample. If the instrument is not, it might not actually give you data that you can use.
Correct, because a good sample, it's not a good sample comes from many things. One is the instrument, but more importantly is before you even apply the instrument, there's what we call the sampling frame. The sampling frame. Now, the reason why we need sampling frame and some of these things is because we want to, as much as possible, as quantitative researchers, speak to the population. And the population is not all about the whole of South Africa. The population could be as simple as the number of children in a certain house. It's a complete population, because the population is the complete listing of any variable of interest in any area. The area could be internet space, it could be a geographic area, but a complete listing of everyone. So if your interest is getting to the population, in some cases, it's simple, sample everybody. But in many cases, unfortunately, you don't have the time, the resources to sample everyone. You want to develop a way to sample such that the sample you draw, as much as possible, represents the population. It's a microcosm of a macrocosm. The macrocosm in this case is the population, and your microcosm that represents the macrocosm is an appropriately designed sample, which of course you have to have what we call a sample design and technique. Make sure that your instrument is right, pilot tested, validated, blah, blah, blah. The list is endless. You can just tick them.
I know we have very little time, and I do hope that you'll be available next week as I talk to people who have examined proposals. I'm going to invite a lot of you come on and off to just give tips to students about what makes a proposal not successful. and what they should look out for before they submit their proposal, so that they avoid a possibility of failure. But before you go, I mean, some of the questions that are coming up here are about the idea that the big problem with doing quantitative research is analysis. You've got this sea of data and then you don't know what to do. What do you say, John?
I've run into students like that who struggle with analysis. Analysis is it's a complex, one of the most difficult things you can think about. You end up collecting your data, like my colleague said, and then you stuck. You're not alone. What I want to tell you is you're not alone. We all, even experienced researchers to an extent, struggle with analysis. Reason being that you end up seeing data that don't look like what you wanted. Then you now have to deal with it. Let me deviate quickly to talk about something which is a lot to do with data mining. Many researchers do this. I have data, I torture my data so that my data confess that that is what I want. So you basically have data and you're beating your data to make sure your data answers the question, gives you an answer you want. So, and you've seen many researchers have fallen into this pit, have published papers that give an answer that they have behind them, making sure that their data answers that, must give you that answer, which is something very wrong with quantitative researchers if they go that route. So I would really come to analysis in the context of choosing the appropriate analysis. If it's a regression, it's pretty much easy. All you need to understand is what is your dependent variable. Your dependent variable would automatically lend itself to the appropriate regression technique to use. So if somebody will wonder, in quantitative research, you could also have qualitative variables. It's very interesting. So you're a quantitative researcher, but you have qualitative variables because some variables are attributes. You're a man, you're a woman, you're transgender. These are attributes. These are not, you can't quantify being a woman. You can't quantify it. It has no meaning in terms of quantity, but you can put them into your model as attributes, as categories. So they are called qualitative variables, and they are also used in quantitative research. So the way your variables are structured to a large extent to determine the kind of analysis to use. And quickly to wrap up is, if you're stuck with analysis, speak to an expert, speak to a supervisor, speak to a senior colleague, someone who's experienced, who's gone through the kind of struggles you're going through. People are always there to help, I would say.
Yeah. And of course, sometimes your supervisor might never have done quantitative research. I mean, my hope is that supervisors also become honest and open with students to say, actually, I haven't done this before, so I'm not able to help you, or whatever, so that students can get help elsewhere. They can get someone who can help the students. But John, we've got 1 minute to go, and so I want to thank you for making your time. It's the second time we're getting you on, and we'll get you on again next week. And of course, next week I will explain what else we talk about. But I look forward to talking to you. It's a pleasure to have you as a colleague, and thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Thanks so much. Cheers, everyone. Yeah.
All right. So that's our session for today. It's our session for today, and I hope you have learned as much as possible in this session. Professor Takuba and Dr. Latif were brilliant. And next week, don't forget, we're talking about your research proposal. What makes a research proposal not succeed? Some people have said, my proposal has been returned, it's been failed, I've got to do it again. What are the pitfalls? And of course, I'll start the session with the importance of a proposal so that you take it seriously. It's not just a document that you write to get accepted. It's an important document in your journey of your postgraduate studies. So thank you so much for joining us. Take care of yourself this week. Focus. I know some of you are taking maybe a little break. Focus on your work. Lots of challenges in the world, but focus on your work and what makes you happy. And go on and do you. So Facebookers, I'm sorry that we got cut, but see you next week. Let me say thank you to the Instagrammers because they go off very quickly just now in 6 seconds. Thank you so much for joining us on Instagram.